Well, good day, everybody, and welcome to another podcast on our Yellow Couch Conversation list. And I'm really, really excited to be here with you today. And not only because I have an opportunity to record a podcast with you, but I've got a very good friend here with me today, Herman Warren. Herman, welcome to our Yellow Couch Conversation.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here, Hennie, and I'm looking forward to the engagement.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Now, Herman, not everybody knows you. I know you. I got to know you at The Economist,
Yep.
and got to understand what an incredible specialist you are in terms of economic affairs.
Thank
But
you.
why don't you tell our audience a little bit about yourself, who you are, and a little bit about your background?
Sure. As you've indicated, we've known each other for a little over the last decade, and the first interaction was
Well,
at.
unnecessary. That sounds unnecessarily long.
My apologies. To date anyone or us. I met you in the context of the Economist when I was running their networking and advisory service. I am running my own firm now. It's called Hela Network, and it does something similar. It helps senior leaders to build their networks, build their perspective. I often say, kind of engage in raised gazing conversations that help them potentially with answers, but always to ask better questions. I spend a lot of my time trying to understand what's happening in South Africa, in the wider region, this wonderful continent that we live in, dynamics and developments within countries, within the region, and how things outside of the African context begin to impact on the economy and the environment for doing business.
Excellent. Herman, thank you for that. So I want to dive right in.
Mhm.
And for me, what we're going to unpack a little bit today is the Africa Free Trade Agreement, and just really what does it mean? So I
Mhm.
think I want to start with that and say, what is this Africa Free Trade Agreement? Can you help us get a little bit of a better understanding of what it is all about?
So, at the headline level, it is the largest free trade agreement in the world by number of countries. And its beginnings go back probably about 60 years. So it was with the
As long as that.
The Organization of African Unity.
Right.
This was in their vision in 1963.
Okay.
It built up additional momentum in the early 90s. I think additional momentum and traction with the Abuja Treaty in 1991. And with the formation of the African Union, I think some real additional momentum was added. In 2012, there was an agreement to set this in place with a target of 2017. As these things go, they're complicated negotiations. You don't always hit kind of the objectives that you have in terms of timing, but I think that one can be particularly impressed given how complicated these things are and the progress that's been made. So the agreement was meant to come into effect in 2020.
Right.
But
And
of course,
we had COVID.
we had
right?
a global pandemic, a once
Yeah.
in a century pandemic that shuttered the global economy. But it was delayed but not denied. So it officially came on stream in January 2021. And the objective behind the agreement is really to build scale and capacity to boost intra-Africa trade, right? So right now, depending on the numbers that you reference, intra-Africa trade is around 15 to 20%.
Right.
And the idea with this is to get that at least up to 40% over the next 15 years or so. So to remove those barriers that prevent goods and services from crossing national boundaries, to make it easier for capital to flow, to make it easier for people to flow, for services to happen, and to build value chains across our markets to kind of encourage that scale. And last but not least, I think before I pause, I think the imperative for this was really underscored in the most recent period by a few events. So the first, the pandemic, which interrupted its beginning, but demonstrated that Africa was shut off from critical value chains as it related to pharmaceuticals and ventilators and things as basic as masks, where countries kind of looked inwardly and said, we're going to put up the walls and protect ourselves, and Africa didn't have that or enough of that productive capacity
Right.
to respond to its domestic needs. That was the one area. The other area, which I think underlined the fundamental importance for this, was the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And that had a big impact on commodity markets, things like grain and sunflower oil and seeds and things of that nature. And unfortunately, Africa is in a situation where it is a net food importer. right? It has a net food import bill of around $50 billion per annum. And as we begin to break down those boundaries to build that scale, we can improve our balance of payments and kind of underwrite our own food security. And then I suppose last but not least, and this really rings true in the kind of time we're in now, is just how protectionism is rising. Trade policy is being weaponized. And it's incumbent upon Africa to look at, and African countries to look to itself to build markets and not just be dependent on certain areas that may be cut off from us. I mean, what comes up often is, well, what happens with AGOA and the kind of preferential free trade agreement there. And the jury is still out, but to all intents and purposes, I think the probability is probably more so on it's dead. Right. And Africa needs to diversify. It needs to within as well as without. But I think the Continental Free Trade Agreement is an important platform for that growth and development to take place.
Herman, you've given us a lot to chew on. So I'm going to try and go back and unpack some of those. Yeah. And you've used some headline numbers. You spoke about intra-Africa trade versus Europe. Now we know, Europe is in the mid 50s. I think in the early 60s, if I'm not mistaken, in terms of intra-Europe trade. Yeah. Pre-Brexit, of course. Yeah. We know that the Americas is about 50-odd%.
Yes.
But why is that? If we just really have to kind of bring it down, why is this going to be potentially, and I say potentially, intentionally,
yes,
a game changer for us in Africa?
Because it's difficult to do business in a fragmented environment. We were talking a bit before the session about the number of countries and territories, 53 countries and territories, probably as many currencies or something similar. There isn't a singular kind of monetary union and payment mechanism, and all of that adds friction to the gears. Often, I'm sure on the platforms that you occupy, people talk about how difficult it is, depending on what passport you carry, to travel around this region. So it's about trying to unlock all of those hurdles which queue up and make it difficult to do trade. Why is the United States trading at the kind of level in North America? In part because of a common monetary union. In part because it's easy to move across borders as individuals and services and so on. We see that clearly in the European Union with the euro and a central European central bank, albeit you have the Bank of England and others, but there's this coordination which helps to facilitate growth and development, the deepening of value chains, and so on and so forth. So I think that's why it's important, and I think that's why it won't be an event. It'll be a process. But we're seeing some important signposts of progress and development. If I cast my mind back by way of example to the turn of the current century, trade wasn't at the level it is now in terms of percentages. Right, I think it was around 10-ish%, perhaps maybe 10 to 12%, depending on which number you reference. And now we're between 15 and 20. So although the objectives with this is probably over the next 15 years to get it up to 40%, it's very achievable based on what we've seen to date. And now it should be supercharged. We actually should hopefully exceed that.
Well, it should be on steroids.
It should be on steroids with this agreement. Now, there's still a lot of road to travel. I think that the tariff lines on at least 90% of the goods have to be reduced or eliminated, and we're almost there. There's still work that needs to be done in the various phases around services and other areas. There's still things that get in the way of trade which have nothing to do with the tariff level. It's like those non-tariff barriers, which you'd be a lot more familiar with than certainly I am. But making it easy to get through border posts, making it easy to have technology and other things facilitate that cross-border trade and so on. There's still work to be done around payments. Because if I'm selling to someone in Kenya, I probably have to go from rands to dollars to shillings. Or if I'm selling in Angola, similarly, rands to dollars, maybe to Kwanza. So we need to figure out how we address that effectively. And I know that the powers that be, the Secretariat, amongst others, are working on that.
I love numbers, and I don't want this podcast to be about numbers. But we talk about consumer market of about 1.3 billion people.
Yes. We
talk about a GDP of north of $3 trillion, I think you said earlier.
Yes. Yeah.
What is the impact on that in particular if we get this right?
So it's a reasonable sum, those kind of numbers that you're talking about, both in terms of population, and we know we have a young population and it's growing. And
40% of the world's youth will be on this continent by
exactly,
2030.
median
Right?
age of 19. We have one of the fastest growing subregions of the global economy. North of 3% this year, and the outlook over the medium term is in a similar range. And what the trade agreement will do will add wind to those sales. So the estimates are that we could add 1 to 3% onto kind of the GDP growth rate if we start to unlock these blockages that prevent kind of trade really taking full flight. So very, very important. And significant headroom to grow. Because to your point, if you look at other parts of the world, they're multiples higher in terms of the intra-regional trade.
In your view, Herman, we often talk about the rising middle class. If we get this right and we get the momentum we all think it deserves, in your view, what will be the impact on the middle class in Africa?
So we're in the fortunate position now where we have economic growth that's faster than population growth on average.
That's
Obviously, in some countries we're not there, but on average across the region that is the case. So people are, at least at the average level, getting richer. To the extent that you begin to accelerate that growth, putting aside whether or not the growth is shared, and that's important, it must be inclusive and broad and deep and so on and so forth, that should aid that per capita growth and support that growth of the middle class. What this trade agreement is also meant to do and to facilitate is value chain creation.
Right.
Not just I'm growing coffee beans, but no, I'm roasting them, I'm sending them out. Not just I'm growing cotton, but we're creating textiles. Not just we're consumers of automobiles, but we're beginning to manufacture them here and make it easier for professionals to move across borders and so on and so forth. And all of that is catalytic in terms of facilitating growth and development, which should feed into a more robust and fuller, if you will, middle class.
So I'm going to interrupt you there, if I may, because it's a lovely segue into part of what I want to check with you. So we talk about that value addition, right? So,
Yes.
so I'm not going to export the beans in its raw format to Japan, but we're going to roast it here, or we're going to add some value in terms of the manufacturing and the supply chain of motor manufacturing. It speaks a little bit to national versus continental priorities.
Yes.
How do we balance those two in lieu of what's happening and what we are aspiring towards in terms of the Africa Free Trade Agreement, but also given the greater macro context, these war and missiles flying almost everywhere at the moment. How do we prioritize this now?
Yeah, so the crafters and drivers of this agreement recognize that, and that's why they're almost different tiers around the more developed kind of markets in the region. So you talk about a South Africa, you talk about a Morocco, you talk about an Egypt, perhaps a Kenya with a broader and deeper industrial base, and your less developed markets. That could be not to unnecessarily calling one out. It might be a Burundi or a Central African Republic. Isn't necessarily going to be in the same position as those others, and they're given concessions, if you will, some additional time to get there. I think it will be incumbent upon the larger, more developed markets, for example, South Africa, which has a $20 billion surplus with the rest of the continent, or Kenya, which isn't as high, but it's certainly over $1 billion, or in Egypt and others, to carry more of the weight. And that might be we actually need to be more open to buying products and so on. And it's not an easy situation to manage because of that asymmetry. And that's why I think some of the elements around the free movement of labor, etc., will take some time because of that lack of balanced or more balanced development. But it will be a process.
So that brings me to our next question. We talk about the free movement of labor. And we also know that on this continent, we've got a number of different trading blocks. So
Yes.
We've got ECOWAS, we've got East Africa, we've got SADC.
Yes.
And we know ECOWAS is pretty successful in terms of the free movement of labor. How do we unlock this? Because that, and we spoke about national versus continental.
Yes.
If you look at the country where you and I are having this podcast right now,
Yeah.
we've got this incredible high unemployment rate. But now you also have a trade agreement that says allow for the free movement of people. Again, my question is, in your mind, how do we balance this? Where do we find the balance, the equilibrium in all of this?
Yeah, these are not easy issues to deal with, and one needs to take a medium to long-term view, but you have to also deal with the near-term sentiments, requirements, the demands, and so on. A practical example of this is what we saw last year when people who lived in countries that house where half of the world's population reside. It was a very tough time for incumbents because there's a lot of frustration for a range of reasons, inflation, but immigration was at the top of the list in many places, certainly in the European Union, certainly in the United States. And we've seen that those kinds of sentiments rise in our neck of the woods as well, and even more particularly in the South African context. So they aren't easy issues to manage politically and otherwise. But what's been proven, I think the data bears it out, is that immigration isn't a net negative. It's a net positive. The innovation, the things that immigrants bring are also net positive. But I think it's about being strategic about how that's managed, what industries are promoted, et cetera, et cetera. So a challenge. And I think that's one of the next big hurdles as we go to this next phase of how that is going to be managed. There are certain sectors, for example, on the service side, that are probably managing that better than others, or playing their kind of their wicket better than others. I think financial services comes to mind. Tourism comes to mind, although it's not exactly the same. You may have a local base of people who can do that, but encouraging the free movement of people, given the kind of multiplier effect you can get out of tourism. But it is certainly something that we need to crack and take the lessons from other parts of the world where there were some positives, but it also had some unintended consequences as people feel as though they may be getting the shorter end of the stick when it comes to immigration that isn't as controlled or as well managed as it should be.
I mean, I want to move on to the next one, and I want to give you 3 headlines, if I may.
Yep.
War between Russia and Ukraine.
Yes.
Fast forward, war between Israel and Gaza. And as of Friday last week, war between Israel and Iran.
Yep.
Is that a headwind or is that a tailwind for the progress of the Africa Free Trade Agreement?
Certainly in the for the global economy, and Africa is not an island removed from what else, everything else that happens. It is integrated into the global economy. Those are headwinds. The Middle East is a critical part of the world. You're talking about an area in that Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, which is 21 miles across, a little over 30 kilometers wide for those familiar with the metric system, where 20% of the world's oil flows, and could potentially be shut down. Putting aside the facilities in that region, whether it's from Saudi or Qatar, et cetera, which are all within range of missiles and other things. If that were to happen, then that would quite conceivably push oil up into triple digits. Highly inflationary, significant shock, which will slow down economic growth, which will have a knock-on effect. Now, obviously, economically speaking, I think it would push the world into recession. So there would be some swings and roundabout, but the swings would be much more so to the downside. So, and Algeria might be happy because, I use that word loosely, but because they produce natural gas, and that might shoot the prices up. Nigeria might see some benefit, but on balance, it would be highly negative to the global economy. Similarly, if we look at the Russia-Ukraine piece,
So, sorry, I'm going to pause you.
yes,
So I get that it's highly negative for the global economy,
yes,
but would that, in your mind, not be that kind of a shake that we need from an Africa point of view to say, does that not force us to become, number one, more reliant?
yes,
Because if you look at it, you know, how much of the world's natural resource resides on this continent? You know, you talk about oil discoveries all over, you know, Namibia, Uganda, Angola, we know is
yes,
producing.
yes,
We now know that Nigeria has got a successful refinery that
yes,
has been
yeah,
started.
yeah.
And I think that's why I'm asking in my own mind this question: is it a headwind or is it a tailwind? Because of what I've just explained. Is that not the shake that we need? And then you couple that with the US aid that has been
Yes,
withdrawn,
yes,
that also has had a
yes,
significant impact on us.
yeah.
Are all those things not playing into at least the rationale to put more effort into bringing to life the Africa Free Trade Agreement?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Henny, and it's another wake up call. I cited three earlier. It was COVID. It was the Russia-Ukraine conflict, amongst and then kind of this trade weaponization of tariffs and trade. Most certainly, I think it'll be an additional wake up call to say, hey, this is important. We need to accelerate the efforts. The progress has been commendable and good, but we need to put even more effort behind hitting the targets that we've set, if not exceeding them, on time, if not before. So yeah, I think it's a very, very fair point.
So I want to give you another headline
Yep.
To add to all of the events that we've just spoken about.
Yep.
BRICS.
Yes.
How does everything that we've spoken about play into what's happening with BRICS? And then I want to add one more to that. And that is, we just heard, I think a day or three ago, China removing all
Yes.
forms of duties on imports from Africa, with the exception, I think, of Eswatini, for political reasons.
Yeah, I think
that's really not for us to debate. But
Yes.
my point is, will that potentially divert the attention from growing intra-Africa trade and swing that attention towards China to say, well, let's rather take those efforts and rather concentrate on growing our exports to China?
I don't think so. But let me also just be clear. I don't know what the tariff lines were on the mix that comes out. I do know that a lot of what goes to China is kind of minerals in their raw form: coal, manganese, graphite, lithium, etc., not beneficiated. So the extent that makes a difference, I'm not entirely sure. China is the region's number one trading partner. China's growth matters to the global economy and to the Chinese economy. China is a key investor in the region. And I think the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is a clear and intentional approach by African leaders to take their development into their own hands. But it doesn't mean that it's just ring-fenced to Africa. You do that with partners. So growth in terms of trade and investment between Africa and the Gulf area clearly kind of is obvious, with Saudi leading the way and the UAE leading the way, Qatar in the top three. The kinds of elements that are important to the global economy and the strategic position of nations, they need to have a relationship with Africa. If we talk about the transition to renewable energy, advanced computing, a lot of that stuff you need to source from Africa. And it's then incumbent upon African leaders to say, okay, well, we have to recognize these relationships and also push our own agenda. That's fine. You may want the lithium, but you're going to have to do some beneficiation here.
I think Botswana is a great example of that, isn't it?
As is Namibia, as is Zimbabwe. You may want to sell your automobiles here, but how much manufacturing are you doing here? What kind of value chains are you creating? So it isn't just a kind of a binary thing. You know, it's important for Africa to develop, and therefore we must, make sure that everything is here. No, you work with others. We live in this ecosystem, this value chain, this interrelated mix, but it's about understanding that and harnessing that understanding to the benefit of the region.
It's a little
So
bit the stone in the pond kind of ripple effect, right?
exactly,
What we're
exactly.
looking for.
So I think that the position that Africa is in is incredibly advantageous if the cards are played right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, let's talk about that a little
yeah,
bit. I mean, I want to bring it back a little bit to,
yeah,
how do we accelerate? I think there's a good understanding now of what the Africa Free Trade Agreement is about.
yeah.
We understand a little bit of how the macro events are potentially influencing that.
Hmm.
But let me bring it back home. And home in this instance for me is Africa
Yes.
as a whole. What is the role of the private sector and SMEs in all of this? How do those two help accelerate,
Yeah,
if at all?
yeah. So it's a really good point, because we talk about intra-Africa trade and how much is happening between South Africa and its neighbors, or Kenya and its neighbors, and so on and so forth. But they're businesses that trade, right? And businesses have to not only understand the potential of the agreement, but also help to shape its direction, right? So engaging through chambers, engaging through, in the South African context, the Department of Trade and Industry, engaging through the Secretariat, the official African Continental Secretariat in Ghana, to help shape the opportunities. So not to be passive, I think, is incredibly important. That's the first point. The other point is, I know some of the initial kind of trades, if you will, that were done, say between Rwanda, I think they sent coffee. It was either to Algeria or Ghana as the first port of call, executing the agreement that came into effect in January 2021. It wasn't some massive conglomerate. It was actually a small and medium-sized enterprise that took advantage of this. To add a bonus point, it was a female-owned business. So, and SMEs are the engine, generally speaking, of growth and where people work and opportunity and so on. So this is net positive for them, and they need to not be passengers or passive. They need to understand and engage and influence and harness the potential of this platform.
That's a great point, Herman. And I just want to, I think it was, I was in Dubai last week, so maybe it was the week before that.
Yeah.
There was this announcement of the Ugandan Airlines that kind of made a cargo plane available to capitalize on this Africa Free Trade Agreement all the way to Nigeria. Do you not think we sometimes get tripped up with this idea that it's always a big, bold move that's required instead of many little things making it a real big thing?
Yeah, I think that's right. It is the many little things. Um, and the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is certainly an enabling framework. And one has to occupy the space within that framework. As I've mentioned earlier, there are various phases. We're promisingly moving through, kind of phase one, but it's incumbent upon all of us to stay engaged, to make sure that we're contributing in our own little and big ways to make the most of the opportunity presented through the trade agreement.
So with that in mind,
Yep.
Herman, what do you think is the one big thing that needs to change to really help accelerate the implementation of this agreement?
What we didn't talk about directly, well, let me back. So I spoke about some of the targets and objectives in terms of intra-Africa trade. I spoke about how that could feed economic growth and development. But one of the big bottlenecks that we face in the region is the infrastructure deficit. And closing that deficit is going to be a little bit more challenging than it has been in the most recent period, because if you cast your mind back, certainly post not even that far, post the global financial crisis, we've had pretty easy money. In some environments, not in the African environment, you had negative rates, but near zero rates. Africa paid a bit more of a premium. But now that we have rates rising, and it looks like it's just hit a new kind of structural level. And why do I say that? Because governments are running consistently high deficits. The key central banks out of Europe, out of the United States, have big deficits. They have large social spending bills. And in the case of Europe, they're having to plow more money into their military.
To the defense.
And that means that as they go to the market to close those deficits, investors are saying, well, okay, I might take your paper, but you're going to have to make it more attractive for me. And that just has a knock-on effect. So I think that is one of the areas. I'm not saying that it's just something we hadn't really touched on. I know it's the focus of many policymakers, development banks, and so on, but it's going to become a lot more challenging. And it's not just about a framework or an agreement. You actually have to have the roads, the rail, the airports, the ports, etc. That really help to unlock unlock the potential of trade.
And my final question, because I think we were about out of time, but
Sure.
my final question to you is, what can leaders like me and you do to help accelerate and educate the market on this?
So one is to talk about it, and I think you've done that exceptionally well. In different fora that I've been involved with, you just saying, hey, are you aware of this? Do you know how you can take advantage of this? Are you actively engaging with it? So don't keep it a secret. And then proactively look for ways that one can make the most of this agreement to serve the African market as well as beyond the African market. Because I think what's become abundantly clear in the environment that we're in, among other things, is that diversity is really important. Diversity of your customer base, diversity of your supplier base. And this is a key tool to build that and to leverage it to the benefit of your organizations. But Hennie, from your perspective, I mean, what do you see as the big kind of area of growth and excitement from a DHL perspective when it comes to the agreement?
Yeah, Herman, I think for me, there's a couple of opportunities for us from a DHL perspective. I think, the one is to continue the role from a thought leadership point of view. And a little bit to your point, we've got to keep on talking about this. Because if we don't talk about it, who's going to talk about it? And why do I think we have an obligation to talk about it? Well, we're the leading logistics company.
Absolutely.
On this continent and one of the big three, certainly globally. And that gives us a bird's eye view of what happens with trade and trade flows. And, we've said it on many an occasion, trade is like water. It'll find a way. You're going to close one door, it'll find a different one to go through for sure. So I think that's the first thing for us. I think in part of that position is to help remove some of those barriers that you spoke about earlier and to engage with authorities on behalf of the industry, not on behalf of DHL, but on behalf of the industry, and to say, if you remove some of these non-tariff barriers, this is the good that can come from it. I think we still have in many instances where authorities feel they need to act as gatekeepers as opposed to economic enablers. And that is an enormous difference for me. But it requires a mind shift, and that takes time. You and I both know. It's like having an argument with your wife. You're always wrong. It just depends on how wrong you are, kind of a thing. And then, because we're in this incredible position from a network point of view, to be the only organization, never mind just in logistics, we're the only organization that's present in all 52 countries and territories on this continent. So who better then to partner up with than with DHL and to say, let us be a part of your journey to expand your business and grow it cross-border. And if I say cross-border, I think so often, we talk to customers and they go, I think I want to take my business to Europe or, maybe to the East.
Yes.
Well, what about right here on your front door? What about your neighbors? Our brothers and sisters in Africa, have you thought about that? So I think that's where I see the opportunity, both from a thought leadership point of view and then just from a commercial economic point of view. I think is a great opportunity for us in that. Ladies and gentlemen, there's so much more I'd love to explain. My very good friend Herman. Herman, it's been wonderful to have you as a part of this podcast.
It's been a pleasure, Hennie. Thank you.
I hope all of you have enjoyed this. We'd love to hear your feedback. Let us know. Please tune in and look forward to your feedback. But ladies and gentlemen, I hope you're all a little bit wiser. on what the Africa Free Trade Agreement is all about and what we can do to make it better and to help this continent grow to its way to prosperity for all of us. So, Herman, with that, thank you very much.
Thank you
Been
for the
absolutely
engagement,
lovely.
Hennie.
Thank you, ladies and
Cheers.
gentlemen, and we'll speak to you next time.
Thanks. Cheers.